The concert hall had never been so silent. 200 of the city's most powerful executives sat frozen in their velvet seats. Champagne glasses suspended midair as a voice, impossible, otherworldly, filled every corner of the room. At the grand piano, Marcus Chen, the CEO who'd made the joke that started it all, felt his throat tighten. The janitor he'd passed in the hallways 1,000 times without truly seeing was singing Beethoven's Ode to Joy in flawless German, and the sound was breaking something open inside every person present. But what Marcus didn't know yet was that this moment would cost him everything he'd built and give him everything he'd been missing. 3 hours earlier, Marcus had been riding high on his usual cocktail of confidence and control. His tech company, Pinnacle Solutions, was celebrating its 10th anniversary with a gala that screamed success, ice sculptures, celebrity caterers, and a string quartet that cost more than most people's annual salary. He'd just closed a deal that would add another $50 million to the company's valuation, and he was feeling invincible in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo. Speech, someone called out, and Marcus grabbed a microphone, grinning that boardroom smile that had charmed investors and intimidated competitors for a decade. "You know what?" he said, the champagne making him bolder than usual. "I'm feeling generous tonight. I'll make you all a promise." He gestured grandly toward the classical musicians, setting up in the corner. "They're going to play Beethoven's Ninth in a bit. If anyone here, and I mean anyone, can sing Ode to Joy in the original German perfectly from memory, I'll give them anything they want. Hell, I'll even marry them if they ask." The crowd erupted in laughter. It was clearly a joke. The kind of impossible challenge wealthy people make when they're sure no one will call their bluff. Beethoven's Ode to Joy in German required not just a good voice, but extensive training, perfect diction, and the kind of musical education that didn't come cheap. Marcus returned to his conversation with the mayor, already forgetting his words. He didn't notice the man in the gray maintenance uniform who'd been replacing trash bags near the stage, his weathered hands pausing in their work. James Wilson had been invisible for so long that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. 62 years old, with silver hair and the kind of deep lines around his eyes that spoke of a life lived fully, joy and sorrow in equal measure. He'd been Pinnacle Solutions' night janitor for 5 years, arriving after everyone left, erasing the evidence of their important days, and disappearing before dawn. But James had a secret that nobody knew. 50 years ago, he'd been a different person, a scholarship student at Juilliard, a tenor whose voice had once made his professor weep. He'd had a future that glittered with promise, until his younger sister got sick, and the medical bills came like an avalanche. He'd dropped out to work, to save her, to be the brother she needed. And by the time she recovered, years later, the window of opportunity had closed. Life had taken him down a different path, and he'd made peace with it. Mostly, he'd kept singing, though, in church choirs where nobody knew his history, in his small apartment where the neighbors complained about the noise, and late at night in the empty offices of Pinnacle Solutions, where the acoustics were surprisingly beautiful, and no one was around to hear him work through the pieces he'd once memorized for performances that never happened. Now, holding a trash bag full of discarded napkins and shrimp tails, James felt something stir in his chest. He looked at the CEO, so confident and comfortable in his wealth, making promises he never expected to keep. James thought about his own life, the choices made, the dreams deferred, the quiet dignity he'd maintained while being looked through rather than looked at. His hands were shaking slightly as he tied off the trash bag. He thought about walking away, finishing his shift, going home to his one-bedroom apartment where his sister's photo still smiled from the mantel. The safe choice, the invisible choice. But something in Marcus's laugh, so easy, so carelessly privileged, made James set down the trash bag and walk toward the stage instead. The quartet was tuning their instruments, discussing the program with the event coordinator. James approached quietly, a lifetime of being unobtrusive, making his movements almost apologetic. "Excuse me," he said softly to the violinist. "That piece the CEO mentioned, Ode to Joy. Are you planning to play it tonight?" The violinist looked at him with barely concealed impatience, clearly seeing only the uniform. Yes, in about 20 minutes. Why? I'd like to sing it, please. If you wouldn't mind. The violinist blinked, then laughed, but not unkindly. She saw something in his eyes that made her curious rather than dismissive. You're serious? Yes, ma'am, in German as the gentleman requested. Within minutes, word had spread through the hall in whispers that created a strange electricity. The janitor wants to sing. The old man in the maintenance uniform thinks he can do it. People gathered closer to the stage, some smirking, others genuinely curious, all of them, expecting either embarrassment or amateur hour entertainment. Marcus, when he heard, felt a complicated mix of emotions. Part of him wanted to laugh it off, but something maybe, the few semesters of ethics classes he'd taken in business school, maybe some deeper instinct made him nod his permission. Let the old man have his moment. He thought it cost me nothing to be gracious. James stood on the stage in his gray uniform, his work boots looking absurdly out of place against the polished wood. The quartet began the familiar melody, and the room settled into that particular quiet that precedes either triumph or disaster. And then James opened his mouth. The first note was pure and clear. A bell struck in a cathedral. The second note built on it, richer, deeper, carrying decades of suppressed artistry. By the third phrase, people had stopped breathing. This wasn't a good voice for a janitor. This wasn't even a good voice for an amateur. This was a voice that should have graced opera houses, that should have made recording history. That should have been one of the great instruments of its generation. James sang in flawless German, every diphthong perfect, every phrase shaped with the kind of interpretive nuance that spoke of true understanding. He sang with his eyes closed, and people in the audience could see tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. He wasn't singing for them, they realized. He was singing for the boy he'd been, for the man he'd almost become. For every night he'd stood alone in empty offices and remembered what his voice could do. When he reached the crescendo, alle Menschen werden Bruder, all people become brothers, his voice soared, with such power and emotion that the champagne flutes on nearby tables actually resonated in sympathy. The mayor's wife began crying. A venture capitalist who hadn't felt genuine emotion in years found, himself gripping his armrests. And Marcus, standing at the back of the room, felt something crack open inside his chest. Some protected place where he'd locked away the memory of what it meant to truly care about something beyond profit, margins, and market share. When the final note faded, the silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then someone began clapping, not the polite, measured applause of society events, but the kind of desperate, overwhelming appreciation that comes from witnessing something that changes you. Within seconds, the entire room was on its feet. Some people openly weeping, others shouting, "Bravo!" like they'd forgotten where they were. James opened his eyes, looking dazed, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd just done. He looked at Marcus, and in that moment, the CEO saw something he'd never noticed in 5 years of passing this man in hallways, a depth of character, of sacrifice, of quiet nobility that made Marcus's own accomplishments feel suddenly hollow. True to his word, though he'd meant it as a joke, Marcus approached the stage. His hand was shaking as he held the microphone. I'm sorry, I don't even know your name. James Wilson, sir? James, Marcus's voice cracked. I made a promise. You can ask me for anything. Anything at all. The room waited. The logical choice would be money, a new job, maybe a comfortable retirement. James stood there in his maintenance uniform, and when he spoke, his voice was as clear as his singing had been. I don't want to marry you, sir, he said, and gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. And I don't want money, but I would like you to see me, really see me, and maybe see all the people you pass every day who have whole universes inside them that you never notice. The security guard who writes poetry, the receptionist who's caring for her elderly mother, the delivery driver who's studying engineering at night. We're here. We've always been here. Marcus felt something shift in his understanding of the world. Later, he would recognize this as the moment. He stopped being a boy, playing at success, and became a man trying to figure out what success actually meant. The gala ended differently than it had begun. Marcus sat with James until 3 in the morning, listening to his story, really listening for perhaps the first time in his life. He learned about Juilliard and sacrifice, about dreams deferred and dignity maintained, about the difference between being successful and being significant. In the months that followed, Pinnacle Solutions changed. Marcus created a program to discover hidden talents among all employees, not just those in corner offices. He funded music lessons, writing workshops, and education stipends. James became the company's cultural liaison, organizing performances and mentorship programs that reminded everyone that human value couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. But more than any structural changes, Marcus himself was different. He learned the names of everyone who worked for his company, their stories, their struggles, their dreams. He learned that wealth wasn't diminished by sharing it, and that seeing people, truly seeing them, was perhaps the most valuable skill a leader could develop. James continued working at Pinnacle Solutions, though his role expanded far beyond maintenance. He sang at company events, at local schools, at nursing homes where people like him, full of unlived dreams and unsung songs, needed reminding that it was never too late to share what you had inside. The story spread far beyond that one night, becoming legend in business circles, not because a CEO kept an absurd promise, but because a janitor's voice had reminded an entire room of powerful people about what really mattered, that every person we encounter carries depths we can't imagine. That kindness isn't charity. It's recognition of shared humanity. That sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply see another person and acknowledge the miracle of their existence. And late at night, when Marcus worked late, he sometimes heard James singing while he cleaned. He would stop whatever he was doing and listen, remembering the night he'd learned that the real measure of success wasn't what you built, but who you became in the building of it.